I tell you what, it's not like the olden days. I'm Jake.
I'm Rosie.
And here is our 2022 update podcast. In many ways, 2022 has been a year of some turmoil and change in the world. The most tangible change for us being, as was mentioned last time, a change of location, which means that while we've always before been speaking to you from somewhere in Hertfordshire, we are now speaking to you from somewhere in Suffolk. When we recorded our Time Busters podcast less than 2 years ago, and I talked about Somerleyton Hall, I thought was just on the Suffolk side of the Norfolk-Suffolk border, little did I realise that within the fairly near future we would be confirming that in person, visiting Somerleyton Hall, which is indeed just on the Suffolk side of the Norfolk-Suffolk border, and finding our way to the centre of the maze, which was the setting for that scene we were talking about, that rather awkward scene where the yellow time buster was blocking the actor, trying to give them the help they needed, and now we ourselves have been and sat and rested in that very gazebo where that happened, which was certainly a very interesting experience. Thinking about the 3 podcasts we recorded in the first half of 2022 before taking our break to move house, the only one I think we had any real further thought about was the Tomorrow People. We discussed in that podcast how the idea that the Tomorrow People couldn't attack any living thing, even in self-defense, was rather limiting and not really brought over when Lee Pressman and Grant Cathro took over the writing of the show. I had thought about mentioning the part where, in the Monsoon Man story, Megabyte is pressing at all the buttons on Colonel Cogg's desk and manages to make the knockout gas come into the elevator and incapacitate Mac McDonald and the other guy. And I thought, can they really get away with that? Is Megabyte just blindly pressing the buttons to see what happens? He's not actually trying to attack people, even though that's what ends up happening. But then we realised, even if you can excuse them for that, in the Dr. Kulek story, at the denouement, Megabyte and Amy definitely are deliberately killing the mosquitoes with the cold gas to stop them escaping. And indeed that very nicely sums up why we can't attack any living thing under any circumstance, even in self-defense, is such a limiting and unwise thing to include on the show. Of course those mosquitoes need deliberately attacking and killing. They're nutter-made genetic abominations posing a direct threat to humanity. Even more understandable to have to forget about that Tomorrow People aspect than the healing power, I think. In the period between recording our previous podcast and moving house, we both individually watched something that we then thought about mentioning on this update podcast. While I was looking for something to watch with my lunch one Saturday afternoon, I found on YouTube the full illegally uploaded version of the CG movie of Dogtanian and the Three Muskehounds, which I did watch, and I thought it was just worth mentioning because I didn't think it was as bad as most things that are made nowadays based on popular old shows. Some of the voiceover work in it was absolutely terrible, and like both Dogtanian and the Three Muskehounds, the original series, and One for All and All for One, the movie version, the Three Muskehounds themselves got rather lost and didn't end up featuring that much, which really has become a persistent problem. But some of the voice work was good. You came in and were struck that Cardinal Richelieu had a good evil cardinal voice. And I did find it quite interesting the way they managed to incorporate Pip from the beginning of the story. As we know in the television series, he turns up about halfway through. They were using him in the kind of spy for the Cardinal in Dogtanian's Inner Circle role that we've seen with Monsieur Bonacieux at times. I'm thinking particularly of the series with Luke Pasqualino and friends, and it happens with the Spike Milligan version of Bonacieux who's in the Richard Lester movies.
I also noticed it was being mentioned that Porthos and Milady had been married, like they seemed to be sort of hinting at perhaps introducing in the original series, and like is in the book and almost all the other adaptations, not Albert the Fifth Musketeer. Of course, I must now remind you, in case you'd forgotten, that Porthos in Dogtanian is really Athos in the books and all the other adaptations, and vice versa. I was actually quite glad to hear that. In a way, it was a bit of an omission not to include it in the original, very long, very good, somewhat faithful Dogtanian series.
And on another occasion, between recording our previous podcast and moving house, you watched something that we talked about to some extent on our Camelot podcast.
Yes, I watched First Night, and it was very interesting, and in some ways I quite enjoyed it. It was diverting anyway, quite engaging with the three main actors, Sean Connery, Richard Gere and Julia Ormond. And I had several thoughts about it. The first thing that comes into my mind is to do with Raven, the CBBC game show, which we have mentioned a few times, I think, because they had in this King Arthur film The Way of the Warrior. They called it the Gauntlet, and they were challenging young men, would-be knights, I suppose they were, I can't really remember the details, to run the gauntlet and do things like avoid spinning round balls and poking swords and shields and things. And I had it recorded on our TiVo box, so I was able to find that bit of the film and show Jake and say, look, it's literally the way of the warrior. And I did wonder if whoever thought of that for Raven had seen the film and taken it at its word, that this was something that really happened in medieval times. That would be pretty stupid of them. I think it's more likely that they were just inspired by the idea.
And I think you said the film reminded you in its tone and style of Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves.
I do remember thinking it would probably make a better Robin Hood film than Camelot film. I could see exactly why little Jake, and perhaps grown-up Jake, thought it was an abomination. It didn't have Merlin, and it didn't have really any of the aspects one would associate with a King Arthur film, or many of them. It was a film all about Guinevere, Lancelot, King Arthur, and a made-up villain. He was basically the Sheriff of Nottingham, and very early on in the film, our introduction to Guinevere is some peasants living in her lands coming and telling her, look, can you stop this oppressive nobleman from overtaxing us, please? And Guinevere tries to speak to him about this, and he says that he wants to marry her, and I can't remember if he says anything like, I'll stop overtaxing the peasants if you marry me. Perhaps he does. But anyway, it seemed very like something Maid Marian would do.
Yes, I think it's very likely after the commercial success of Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, someone started planning a Camelot film that's basically the same film soon afterwards.
Guinevere meets Lancelot in the woods on her way to marry Arthur. What happens is that Lancelot stumbles upon Guinevere getting robbed and murdered and things, I think by somebody sent by the main villain of the movie. And of course he helps her out, but he does it in a very unorthodox way, making her think perhaps that she can't trust him, where he says to this murderer, well, don't you want to rape her first? She's really hot, I'll help you, let's take turns. From there he's able to overpower this villain, and then he and Guinevere have to run through the forest together and, I don't know, tumble down hills and cuddle up hiding in the long grass and stuff that would make quite an interesting first meeting of Robin Hood and Maid Marian, as I was saying. What Lancelot was doing was very like the sort of thing Robin Hood might be doing, and he's in a bit of trouble himself, I think, and comes and wins this Way of the Warrior gauntlet in order to become a Knight of the Round Table. You said when we did our Camelot podcast that Guinevere met Lancelot first, or knew him first. She did know Arthur as a friend of her dad's, a sort of favourite uncle, an older man that she looked up to, admired, liked, and she seemed sort of quite happy to marry him and thought that he would be a good husband. But then, of course, she didn't bank on actually falling in love with a young, brave, handsome, etc. Lancelot. And my memory of Arthur finding out about their affair and crying out in front of a window is almost correct. He does a lot of standing in front of windows and looking out of windows. I think the director had a bit of a thing about windows, and when he's crying out in anguish, it's why at this altar that he's always or often going to visit in times of trouble.
I read just before recording the Camelot podcast that Lancelot and Guinevere already knew each other, were perhaps associated in some way. I didn't realise, I hadn't picked up, I don't know if what I read mentioned it, that they'd only just met in the woods just before. Another thing we've done since moving house is visit Norwich Cathedral and sign the Book of Remembrance for Queen Elizabeth II. And yet another thing we've done since moving house is watch Jurassic World Dominion on DVD. Now, this was the first time I'd seen it. I thought it was an absolutely terrible movie. Absolutely no mitigation this time of some things about it being okay or good for me, as with the other Jurassic World movies. I thought it was all over the place, a lot of stupid, nonsensical plots that didn't match up. It was very hard to see what the overall narrative was trying to achieve or trying to be. And a lot of the time I was thinking, well, where are the dinosaurs? It's not even that they had the stupid locusts instead of the dinosaurs, which I thought might be the problem when I read about the locusts. But no, the locusts weren't in it much either. A lot of the time I was thinking, well, why am I sitting here trying to watch a Jurassic Park movie? There's no dinosaurs. It's all stupid things going on that I'm absolutely not engaging with and don't involve dinosaurs at all.
I went to see it in the cinema because I was very curious. I was expecting not to like it at all from the trailers that I'd seen, and even though I didn't really read anything beforehand, I did get the overall impression that the fans who saw it before me and were keen enough to go to the cinema on opening day thought it was dreadful, which was surprising in these days when they will say they like anything. And you pointed out, well, they don't really care because they know it's the last one. They're not hoping for any sequels, which is why people say, oh yes, I love it, make more. And in fact, in the cinema, I was more engaged, I would go so far as to say I enjoyed it more, or bits of it, than I was expecting to. When the DVD came in the post and I watched that, I thought, yeah, okay, it's worse than I thought. So I guess my expectations affected both my watchings of it, as happened with Richard Lester's Three Musketeers and Four Musketeers. But what did interest me, keep me engaged, were the three veteran actors, Sam Neill, Laura Dern and Jeff Goldblum. One thing I don't happen to agree with, that if you've read any reviews and fan opinions you might have seen, is that those three actors somehow didn't get into it, weren't able to make anything at all of the script, sleepwalked through their lines, whatever people say. I thought they made the best of what they had. I enjoyed watching them. I was also quite impressed with Isabella Sermon as Maisie, obviously a few years older than when she appeared in Fallen Kingdom, and I think she's come along very well as an actress, become engaging, and I enjoyed watching her with those three veterans, particularly Ellie and Alan, who she's with the most. It took too long for them to get together with Ian and be an awesome foursome, and I wished I could see a movie all about Ellie, Alan, Ian and Maisie, and I wished I could see a scene like the one between Alan and Eric in Jurassic Park 3. Unfortunately, there wasn't time for anything like that because they were doing all sorts of other nonsense, and it really was nonsense. Anything that Bryce Dallas Howard, Chris Pratt and friends were trying to do. But an interesting link with something Jake was saying earlier in this very podcast is that it did remind me of the Tomorrow People. The elevator gas and the genetically engineered insects you mentioned, the locusts, and thereafter grain, of course, with which people make cereal, among other things. In the Tomorrow People, one of the stories is all about cereal, very high stakes, as I sarcastically said. And when Ellie and Alan were getting gassed in some sort of elevator or locust airlock or something, I didn't exactly forget and think, why don't they teleport? But I was just reminded of thinking, why don't they teleport when the Tomorrow People were getting gassed in an elevator? And I was also reminded of them going after genetically engineered insects and trying to save the cereal in different adventures.
Yes, instead of following through on what they were supposed to do, which was to show a world of dinosaurs and humans attempting to coexist, they did a mash-up of the two stories from the second series of the Tomorrow People instead, which was a strange and rather unwise decision. The direct sequel to Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom is the short Jurassic World Battle at Big Rock, which is also pretty bad, but at least it seems to follow on from the end of Fallen Kingdom. When we return for our next regular podcast, on the final Sunday in February, we'll be looking back once again at the world of BBC sitcoms, and also at the sci-fi fantasy genre, as we talk about Goodnight Sweetheart. That reminds me, one thing we've said on podcasts before is that Roger Sloman is in everything. He's in the first two episodes of Grange Hill as the horrible PE teacher. He's in the final series of Bergerac as the inspector. He's in the British Empire as a shopkeeper who's one of the many people who has a grudge against Gordon British. He's in two early episodes of Mr. Bean as the blind man and the heart attack man, two different characters. He's in the final episode of the first series of Blackadder as Three-Fingered Pete. And something I had thought of mentioning in the Tomorrow People podcast but didn't get round to was that Roger Sloman is in the Kulex Experiment as the disbelieving policeman. And I think we should say next time when we're talking about the main character in Goodnight Sweetheart, Gary Sparrow, Roger Sloman makes an appearance in Goodnight Sweetheart as Gary's dad, so hopefully we won't forget to say that. On our Time Busters podcast, we mentioned another Goodnight Sweetheart guest star, Michael Troughton, in another time travel related role, as well as his role as Professor McNulty in Time Busters. So perhaps we'll remember to mention him as well. But whatever we mention, it will all be about Goodnight Sweetheart, and it will be, as I said, on the final Sunday in February 2023. Also worthy of note, just before we go, thinking about something else I said on an earlier podcast this year, it is now 10 years since CITV's Old School Weekend, which we used to talk about as something so recent on our early podcast. Well, there we are. It's not recent at all now, but certainly it has been and continues to be a useful point of reference for some things we want to talk about. And now I'm going to say something I haven't said since our very first update podcast 6 years ago. The reason being that we've released them later in January ever since that first time. Happy New Year out there.
Whatever you are.